Imagine this, friends. Let's start with a bold assumption. It's Friday night, late November 2025, around 11 p.m., and you're getting ready for bed when suddenly your phone screen goes black. Restarting doesn't help. You walk to the living room and find the TV is dead too, the router lights are all out. Looking out the window, you see the entire city has plunged into darkness. It's not just a power outage, all electronic systems have crashed. Phones, computers, ATMs, supermarket checkout systems, hospital electronic medical records, traffic lights, security cameras, everything's down. Later you find out this was an unprecedented global cyber attack. All network devices have been infected by a virus, and repairs will take at least 72 hours. Now here's the question, what would you do during those 72 hours? You open your wallet and find only $20 in cash. All your savings are in bank accounts, but now the bank's computer systems are paralyzed, you can't withdraw money. You want to go to the supermarket to buy water and food, but the checkout system is broken. The clerk says they can only take cash, and because the security cameras aren't working, they've decided to close temporarily. Walking down the street, you notice all the traffic lights are out, but thankfully everyone's still following the rules, yielding to each other. First hour, you think this is just an inconvenience, everyone's still pretty civilized. Second hour, you hear sirens in the distance, someone's smashing store windows. Fourth hour, you see a convenience store owner standing at his door with a baseball bat because someone tried to rob him. Eighth hour, your neighbor knocks on your door, asking if you have extra food to trade, he's willing to exchange his watch for 2 bottles of water. 12th hour, you start regretting not going to the supermarket earlier to stock up, the streets are dangerous now. 24th hour, you hear that a community has spontaneously organized a patrol, but they're also collecting protection fees from every household. 48th hour, you don't dare go outside because there are armed gangs looting out there. 72nd hour, when power and internet are finally restored, you find the city is unrecognizable, smashed windows everywhere, looted stores, and dozens of murders. And what shocks you most is that all this took just 3 days. 3 days for a modern civilized city to regress into a jungle. You might say, that's too exaggerated, how could things fall apart so quickly? But history tells us this kind of thing really happens. During the 2003 Northeast blackout in America, New York saw massive looting within 14 hours. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, New Orleans became hell on earth within days. And this thought experiment asks you, during those 72 hours, what would you do? If you saw someone looting, would you help stop them or pretend you didn't see? If your neighbor wanted to steal your food, would you fight back? If a stranger said he wanted to organize everyone for defense but demanded absolute power to distribute resources, would you agree? More importantly, when order is restored, would you regret what you did during those 72 hours? Would you make choices you'd absolutely never make under normal circumstances, just to survive? This isn't science fiction, it's the real dilemma we're facing, and 370 years ago someone already figured it out. His name was Thomas Hobbes, a strange old man who was called an atheist by his contemporaries and hailed as the father of political philosophy by later generations. But today I don't want to tell you Hobbes was a great philosopher. What I want to tell you is that this old man wrote a 17th century science fiction novel, and the world described in that novel is the world we're living in today. The story starts in 1640. That year Hobbes was 52 years old. Before then he was just an ordinary person tutoring aristocrats, translating ancient Greek texts, teaching Latin to young lords, occasionally traveling Europe with his employers, living a quiet, uneventful life. But in 1640 the English Civil War broke out, and suddenly the whole world went mad. It's hard to imagine what kind of chaotic era that was. The king fought Parliament, Protestants fought Catholics, Scots fought the English, and most bizarrely, nobody really knew what they were fighting for. Some said it was for freedom, some said for God, some said for tradition. In the end they actually cut off King Charles I's head. This was an earth-shattering event at the time, like someone suddenly executing the American president in front of the White House. Hobbes was terrified. He quickly fled to France, and while hiding from the war, he kept thinking about one question: how did human society suddenly collapse like this? If you enjoy thought stories like this, creating them really isn't easy, so I hope you can give me a like and subscribe for support. The story ahead gets even better. While in exile in France, Hobbes encountered something that changed his life, not some revolutionary manifesto, not some political theory, but a mathematics book, Euclid's Elements. The story goes that once when visiting a friend, he saw a geometry textbook open on the table. He casually flipped to a page and couldn't put it down. He saw the proof process of a theorem, starting from the simplest axioms, deducing step by step, link by link, finally reaching an irrefutable conclusion. Hobbes was stunned on the spot. He said, "How could this be so brilliant? This reasoning was perfect to the point of breathtaking." That year he was already in his 50s, having spent most of his life studying humanities, and suddenly discovered this was how science worked. This feeling was like a middle-aged person suddenly discovering a new continent. After that, Hobbes became obsessed with studying science, physics, geometry, human anatomy. A crazy idea popped into his head: if geometry could be studied this way, why not political science? Think about it, Europe at that time was experiencing the scientific revolution. Galileo used telescopes to look at stars and discovered Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Harvey dissected corpses and discovered blood circulation. The entire worldview was being overturned. And Hobbes thought even further. He wondered, if the human body is a machine, couldn't the state also be a machine? If blood circulation could be explained by science, couldn't political operations also be explained by science? This idea might not seem like much today, but in the 17th century it was absolutely heretical, because people then believed politics was arranged by God, kings were heaven's mandate. How could you compare sacred politics to a cold machine? But Hobbes did exactly that, and he did it thoroughly. In 1651, Hobbes published the book that changed the world. It was called Leviathan. Leviathan is a monster from the Bible, the most terrifying creature in the ocean that no weapon can harm. When this title came out, everyone was confused. You're a political philosopher, how can you name your theory of the state after a monster? But Hobbes had his reasons. He said, look at this world, war everywhere, chaos everywhere, people tearing each other apart like beasts. In this situation, only a more powerful monster can stop it all. This logic sounds scary, right? But think carefully, isn't our world today exactly like this? Look at the news, people arguing fiercely over every social issue. Should we manage climate change? How should immigration policy be set? Should taxes increase or decrease? Everyone thinks they're right, everyone thinks others are idiots. Hobbes said this state is the state of nature. When there's no strong authority to make decisions, human society falls into a war of all against all. Notice he said all against all, not good people fighting bad people, not justice defeating evil, but everyone fighting everyone, because everyone thinks they're right. This observation is so sharp. He saw through the most fundamental thing in human nature: everyone believes their own judgment, everyone thinks they've grasped the truth. When you're on Twitter calling someone else an idiot, they're calling you an idiot too. You both think you represent justice, you both think the other is stupid. So what happens in the end? Hobbes's era was the same. Protestants said Catholics were heretics, Catholics said Protestants were devils, Puritans said you're all wrong. Finally they really started fighting and beat England to pieces. And what's worse, these disputes had no standard answers. What kind of worship ceremony does God prefer? How much power should the king have? These questions don't have standard answers like math problems. Hobbes said that's exactly the problem. When humans face questions without standard answers, each person's reason gives different answers, and these different answers lead to endless disputes and ultimately war. So he said there's no such thing as natural correct reason in the world, only this person's reason and that person's reason. Your reason tells you it should be this way, my reason tells me it should be that way, then we fight. This view is so relevant today. Look at social media now, everyone lives in their own information bubble, everyone thinks they've grasped the truth. Liberals think conservatives are crazy, conservatives think liberals are crazy. So what do we do? Hobbes gave an answer that shocked everyone: since people can never reach agreement on ideas, then stop trying to reach agreement, just find something to forcibly unify them. That thing is Leviathan, a sovereign with absolute power. Whatever it says goes. No need to explain why, no need to prove it's right. As long as it says so, everyone must listen. You might say, isn't this dictatorship, isn't this tyranny? But Hobbes would tell you, choose either a powerful Leviathan, or war of all against all. He'd ask you, would you rather live in a world where you might be killed any day, or live in a world controlled by absolute power but at least safe? This question is brutal because it strikes at the deepest human fear, the fear of death. Hobbes said humanity's most fundamental motivation is avoiding violent death. What's violent death? It's when you could live to 80 but die at 40 because of war or violence. This is what humans fear most. So humans are willing to give up almost all freedom just to get one promise, a promise that you won't die violently. And Leviathan is what provides this promise. It could be a king, could be parliament, could be any form of government, but it must have absolute power, because only absolute power can stop that war of all against all. Now you understand why I say this is a science fiction novel, right? Because Hobbes imagined an unprecedented political creature. This creature is simultaneously God, beast, man, and machine. It has absolute authority like a god, it's powerful and terrifying like a beast, it can think and make decisions like a human, it operates coldly like a machine. This imagination was so ahead of its time that 17th century people couldn't accept it at all. The royalists said, Hobbes, you're crazy, this isn't supporting royal power, this is insulting the king, because Hobbes turned the king into a machine. The church was even angrier. They said, Hobbes, you're an atheist, because Hobbes said religion should completely submit to Leviathan, even God's business must listen to Leviathan. Even those supporting Parliament didn't like him, because Hobbes said power must be absolute, can't be divided, can't be checked and balanced. This completely contradicted their advocacy of parliamentary democracy. So after Hobbes published this book, he offended almost everyone. Royalists cursed him, revolutionaries cursed him, the church cursed him, even his friends started avoiding him. But most ironically, this book cursed by everyone became the starting point of modern political philosophy, because Hobbes did something unprecedented, he separated politics from theology. Before Hobbes, people couldn't discuss politics without God, without tradition, without morality. But Hobbes said these don't matter. What matters is how humans move from a state of mutual slaughter to a state of peace. He didn't care what justice is, didn't care what virtue is. He only cared about one question, how to stop humans from killing each other. This question is so modern. How modern? Look at all the problems we face today. Should AI make decisions for humans? Should the government monitor citizens' data? Where are the boundaries of free speech? The essence of all these questions is the same. When humans can't reach consensus on an issue, who makes the final decision? Do we let everyone keep arguing, or find an authority to forcibly resolve it? Hobbes saw this problem 370 years ago, and the answer he gave still makes us uneasy today, because this answer is too extreme, yet too reasonable. So how exactly did Hobbes reach this conclusion step by step? What did he experience during those years in French exile that gave him such a dark understanding of human nature? And more crucially, how did he transform this dark understanding into a rigorous theoretical system? This brings us to a great scientific debate that occurred in the 17th century. This debate was ostensibly about the physics question of whether vacuum exists, but actually it was about the political question of how knowledge is produced and who defines truth. And Hobbes was right at the center of this debate. Imagine you're an aristocrat in London in 1660, and you receive an invitation saying a gentleman named Robert Boyle will demonstrate a miraculous machine that can pump out air and create a vacuum. You might think what's so interesting about that, but you still go, because this was trendy among London aristocratic circles then. Watching scientific demonstrations was like going to TED Talks today. You enter the laboratory and see a complex device with glass covers, pistons, various gears and pipes. Boyle proudly introduces this as his invention, the air pump, which can extract all the air from a container. Then he does an experiment, placing a glass tube filled with mercury into this vacuum container and starting to pump. As the air is extracted, you see the mercury column in the glass tube slowly lowering. Boyle says triumphantly, "See, this proves the existence of atmospheric pressure and also proves that vacuum exists." The aristocrats below all applaud, thinking this is amazing, science is truly remarkable. But just then, an old man in a thick coat stands up from the crowd and says in a very sarcastic tone, "Mr. Boyle, with all due respect, your experiment proves nothing." This old man is Hobbes. He's already in his 70s, reportedly looks like a bear, with a temperament just as grumpy. Hobbes says your air pump hasn't pumped out the air at all. Your experimental results prove precisely that vacuum doesn't exist, because if vacuum existed, the mercury column should drop completely to the bottom. But in your experiment, the mercury column only lowered somewhat, which shows there's still air in the container. Boyle gets angry and says that's because my equipment isn't perfect yet, but the theory is correct. Hobbes sneers and says you're just making excuses. When the experiment doesn't work out, you blame the equipment. I could just as well say it's because you didn't operate it properly. The two start arguing like this, and it gets more and more heated, from scientific issues to personal attacks, almost coming to blows. You might think, is this really necessary? It's just discussing whether vacuum exists as a physics problem. Does it warrant such anger? But the problem is, this isn't just a physics problem. This is a political problem about how knowledge is produced and who defines truth. Boyle represents a new way of producing knowledge. He says we should establish a circle of gentlemen scientists, people with status and position, respectable people. They do experiments together, witness results together, discuss conclusions together, and produce reliable knowledge this way. Moreover, Boyle particularly emphasizes experimental reproducibility. He says a good experiment should be replicable by anyone. As long as you follow my steps, you get the same results. Only knowledge produced this way is reliable. This sounds reasonable, right? Isn't this the basic method of modern science? But Hobbes sees something else. Hobbes says you people are forming a clique. You form a club, then say only people in your club are qualified to judge what truth is. Isn't this power monopolization? And what particularly bothers Hobbes is that Boyle's people are all aristocrats, all upper-class people. Ordinary people can't enter this circle at all, because doing these experiments is too expensive. An air pump costs several years' income for a middle-class person. So Hobbes says, you claim science is open to everyone, but actually you're using money and status to set barriers. How is this different from those religious sects? This criticism is too harsh because it directly hits the sore spot of the English Civil War. You see, the English had just experienced a civil war, and to a large extent this civil war was caused by various religious factions fighting each other. Protestants had their own circle, Catholics had their own circle, Puritans had yet another circle. Each circle said they grasped the truth, and finally they really started fighting. Now Boyle's scientists want to form a new circle. Although they discuss physics rather than theology, in Hobbes's view, the nature is the same, a group of people gathering together, then saying only our views are correct. Hobbes says, do you want to repeat the Civil War? Do you want to turn the scientific world into a battlefield too? Boyle certainly doesn't think so. He says we're different from those religious fanatics. We use reason and experimentation to pursue truth, not engaging in dogma and superstition. But Hobbes says, reason? Are you sure you mean reason? What you mean is just Robert Boyle's reason, your circle's reason. Why is your reason more correct than others? This question is too philosophical and too political. It involves a fundamental question. In a society divided by views, who has the power to define what truth is? Boyle's answer is, let qualified people decide together through reasonable procedures. Hobbes's answer is, stop the nonsense. There's no such thing as qualified people, no such thing as reasonable procedures. In the end it still comes down to whose fist is bigger. You might think Hobbes is too cynical, but think carefully, isn't what he says somewhat true? Today we discuss climate change. Scientists say the Earth is warming, presenting mountains of data and models, but there are still people who don't believe it, saying these scientists are lying, taking research funding. Today we discuss vaccine safety. Medical experts say vaccines are safe, presenting countless clinical trial reports, but there are still people who don't believe it, saying these experts have been bought by pharmaceutical companies. Why is this? Because in many people's eyes, experts are just a small circle, a circle with power to define truth, not some objective neutral guardian of truth. Hobbes saw this problem 370 years ago. He said if you establish this expert system, it will ultimately only lead to more division and conflict, because there will always be people questioning experts' qualifications and motives. So what do we do? Hobbes gives that uncomfortable answer again: stop the expert consensus stuff, stop the rational discussion stuff, just find an absolute authority to make the call. Leviathan says vacuum exists, then it exists, says it doesn't exist, then it doesn't exist. No need for experiments, no need for proof. As long as Leviathan says so, Everyone must accept it. Boyle explodes when he hears this, saying, "Hobbes, you're anti-science, you're anti-intellectual." Hobbes says, "I'm not anti-science, I'm against your small group politics disguised as science. Real science should be like geometry, deducing conclusions from axioms, not having a group of people vote on what truth is." Who won this debate in the end? On the surface it was Boyle, because he became the leader of the Royal Society. His experimental methods became the standard for scientific research, while Hobbes was excluded from the Royal Society, treated as a contentious old crank. But actually, the problem Hobbes raised was never truly solved. The scientific community was indeed established, but it's also indeed a circle with barriers. You need degrees, need to publish papers, need peer review. These are all tickets to enter this circle. And more importantly, the kind of conflict Hobbes predicted really happened. The scientific world isn't always harmonious. Different schools attack each other, different paradigms compete with each other. Sometimes scientific disputes also become power struggles. Look at today's academic circles. How many disputes are actually not about truth, but about whose theory dominates, who can get more research funding, who can publish in top journals? If Hobbes were alive today, he'd definitely say, "See, what did I tell you? You academics are essentially no different from those who used to do religion, all fighting for discourse power." But this air pump debate brought an unexpected gain to Hobbes's political theory. It made him more convinced of one view: humans can never truly reach consensus at the level of ideas. Look, even a physics question like whether vacuum exists can be argued like this. Is there any possibility of reaching consensus on more complex political questions, moral questions, religious questions? Hobbes says impossible. Humans will always be divided on ideas, because each person's reason gives different answers, and these different answers lead to endless disputes and conflicts. This is why Hobbes completely abandoned the path of seeking consensus in his political theory. He doesn't believe humans can reach agreement through rational discussion, doesn't believe they can find a truth everyone recognizes. What's his solution? Since we can't find consensus, let's create consensus, use power to forcibly unify ideas. One important function of Leviathan is to provide final answers to all disputes. What is justice? What is virtue? What is truth? Leviathan decides. This sounds scary, right? But Hobbes would say, do you have a better way? Do you want society to stay stuck in endless disputes? Do you want everyone to insist on their own truth and then kill each other? This question is too heavy because it forces us to choose between two imperfect options. Either accept a possibly arbitrary authority to maintain order, or accept a chaotic society full of disputes and conflicts. Hobbes chose the former without hesitation, because in his view, any form of order is better than chaos, any form of peace is better than war. But the key question comes, what exactly is this Leviathan? How is it produced? Why can it have such great power? Hobbes's answer might be the boldest thought experiment in the history of political philosophy. He says Leviathan is man-made, created by us ourselves. This idea is too crazy, because before Hobbes, almost everyone thought political power was natural or divinely ordained. The king's power came from God, or from tradition, or from bloodline. But Hobbes says no, power isn't given by God, isn't passed down from ancestors, but is voluntarily ceded by each of us. He imagined a scenario, a group of people living in a state of nature, living in fear every day, worried about being killed by others, worried about their things being robbed. This life is too painful. So these people gather together to discuss, we can't go on like this, we need to find a way to end this state of mutual harm. Someone suggests, how about we find a person or an organization, give our power to them, let them protect us and maintain order. Everyone thinks this is a good idea. After all, the power I have now is useless, I'm on edge all day. Might as well trade power for safety. So everyone signs a contract, ceding all their power to a sovereign. This sovereign is Leviathan. This is the basic logic of social contract theory, and Hobbes was the first person in history to systematically expound this theory. But Hobbes's social contract theory has a very unique feature. Once the contract is signed, you can't back out. You can't say, oh, I changed my mind, this Leviathan is too authoritarian, I want my power back. Hobbes says no, once the contract is signed it's permanent, because if you allow backing out, we'll return to the state of nature, fall back into the war of all against all. So in Hobbes's theory, Leviathan has absolute power. It can decide everything, can make any law, can punish anyone, and the people have no right to resist. Your only right is to save your life. If Leviathan wants to kill you, you can run, can resist, because saving your life was your original purpose in signing the contract. But besides this, you have no other rights. This theory is too extreme, so almost all later contract theorists had to revise it. Locke said no, people have the right to resist tyranny. Rousseau said no, sovereignty belongs to the people and can't be ceded. But Hobbes insisted on his view. He said if you allow people to resist, then there's no contract, because everyone can say this government is tyranny and I want to resist. Then in the end it still falls into chaos. Hobbes's logic is too cold, but also too clear. He pushed political theory to an extreme, letting us see what the price of order is. That's freedom. If you want order you must give up freedom, if you want peace you must accept authoritarianism. Now we're entering the darkest and most fascinating part of Hobbes's theory, his dissection of human nature. Hobbes has a very famous saying, "Man is a wolf to man." This phrase has been quoted countless times, but many people misunderstand it, thinking Hobbes is saying human nature is evil. Actually no, what Hobbes says is much more complex and subtle. Hobbes says humans are machines driven by desire. And what is desire? The most basic are two kinds, seeking benefit and avoiding harm, liking and disliking. That's simple. You like good food, you hate pain, you like being respected, you hate being humiliated. All human behavior can be reduced to these two basic drives. Sounds very mechanical, right? But Hobbes deliberately reduces human behavior to this mechanical level, because only this way can he establish a political science as rigorous as geometry. But here's the problem, if everyone just pursues their own desires, won't society fall apart? Hobbes says yes, that's why the state of nature is chaotic. Without authoritative constraints, everyone will pursue what they want, and resources are limited, so conflict inevitably occurs. But there's a deeper problem here. Hobbes observed that humans have three particularly strong tendencies: competition, diffidence, and glory. Competition is easy to understand. Two people see the same piece of land, both want it. What to do? Have a fight. Diffidence isn't hard to understand either, you don't know when others will come rob your things, so you must stay vigilant, even strike first. But the third one, glory, this is the most interesting. Hobbes says humans particularly care about face, particularly care what others think of them. You cannot take my money, not take my land, but you can't look down on me, can't mock me, can't say I'm worthless. And humans will fight over things that seem trivial to others, just because of face. Think about it, isn't it like this? How does road rage happen? Isn't it because you feel that driver disrespected you? How do online flame wars happen? Isn't it because you feel the other's view is insulting your intelligence? Hobbes says humans can pay any price for glory, even their lives. This is more terrifying than simple material competition. Because material is limited, once you've grabbed it, it's gone. But glory is unlimited, you can always find new reasons to prove you're nobler than others. So in the state of nature, humans not only fight over conflicts of interest, but also fight because of diffidence, and even more so because of face. These three drives combined result in what Hobbes called, war of all against all. But there's a very critical premise here, Hobbes says humans are equal. You might think, isn't equality a good thing? How can equality lead to war? Hobbes's logic is this, precisely because everyone is roughly the same, everyone thinks they have a chance to win. He says nature makes humans roughly equal in body and mind. The strongest person can still be killed by the weakest, because the weak can use cunning, can unite with others, can strike when you're sleeping. This observation is so important because it forms a sharp contrast with the dark forest law and the three-body problem. In the three-body problem, when a lower civilization meets a higher civilization, it can only be crushed, like ants meeting humans, no chance to resist at all. But Hobbes's world isn't like this. In Hobbes's world, ants can kill humans, as long as they're smart enough, united enough, ruthless enough. This leads to a paradox. Precisely because everyone might win, no one dares relax their guard, everyone must try to strike first. Think about it, if you knew the other side was 100 times stronger than you, you'd probably just give up, surrender when you should, run when you should. But if you know the other side is only slightly stronger than you, or you're roughly equal, then you'd think, should I try? What if I win? This sense of insecurity caused by equality is more terrible than inequality. And Hobbes discovered an even darker truth about human nature: everyone overestimates their own abilities. He says some people might think they're wiser than others, but actually everyone thinks this way, so this confidence is basically an illusion. When you're driving, don't you think your driving skills are above average? When you're working, don't you think you're smarter and more hardworking than your colleagues? When you're debating, don't you think the other side is utterly stupid? Psychologists later confirmed this. It's called the superiority bias. Most people think they're above average. But if everyone thinks they're above average, that's mathematically impossible, right? Hobbes saw through this 370 years ago. He said, what does this self-overestimation lead to? It leads to everyone being unwilling to compromise, everyone thinking they should get more. You think this land should be yours because you're smarter and more diligent. I also think this land should be mine because I'm also smarter and more diligent. So what happens in the end? Have a fight. So Hobbes's state of nature isn't a jungle where savages slaughter each other, but a battlefield where everyone thinks they're right and should win. The scariest thing about this battlefield is there's no referee. In a society with government, when you have a conflict with someone, you can go to court and let a judge decide who's right and wrong. But in the state of nature, there's no judge, everyone is their own judge. Hobbes says this is the problem, because when it comes to their own interests, no one can stay objective. You think this deal is fair, I think you're taking advantage of me. You think this land is yours, I think it's mine. Who decides? No one can decide, so in the end it can only be resolved by violence. And what's worse is that even if we have no conflict now, I still have to guard against you possibly attacking me in the future. Because in the state of nature, there's no guarantee, no promise can be trusted. You tell me today let's live in peace, how do I know you won't ambush me tomorrow when I'm not prepared? So I have to strike first. But the problem is you're thinking the same thing, you're also wondering whether to strike first. This forms a vicious cycle. Everyone distrusts everyone else, everyone wants to attack first, and the result is they really do start fighting. Does this logic sound a lot like the prisoner's dilemma? Two people could both benefit from cooperation, but because of mutual distrust, they both end up choosing betrayal. Hobbes saw this core game theory problem 300 years ago. He said without enforcement to guarantee it, promises are meaningless. You sign a peace agreement with me, but if no one can punish violators, this agreement is just waste paper. So Hobbes says in the state of nature, there's no justice, no injustice, no right or wrong, because these concepts all need an authority to define them. Robbery isn't evil because there's no law saying you can't rob. Lying isn't immoral because there are no moral standards. Murder isn't a crime because there's no criminal law. This sounds too terrible, right? But Hobbes deliberately pushes this logic to the extreme to show you what a world without government looks like. He says in this state, human life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This phrase is too famous. Solitary because you can't trust anyone, poor because you don't dare develop production, nasty because you have to do anything to survive, brutish because you have to be ruthless to others to protect yourself, short because you could be killed at any time. And Hobbes says in this state there's no industry, no navigation, no construction, no arts, no letters, no society. All these need a stable environment to develop. You want to build a house, but it might be taken away halfway through construction. You want to do business, but goods might be robbed before arrival. You want to write a book, but you might die before finishing it. So the state of nature isn't just a violent state, it's also a stagnant state. All of humanity's civilizational achievements can't be produced in this state. Now you understand why Hobbes said humans must have a Leviathan, right? Because only an authority with overwhelming force can break this vicious cycle, can free humanity from this state of mutual suspicion and mutual harm. But there's a very interesting question here. Is this state of nature Hobbes describes something that really existed, or did he imagine it? Actually, Hobbes himself didn't give a clear answer. Sometimes he'd say, look at those American natives, aren't they in a state of nature? Sometimes he'd say actually nation-states are in a state of nature with each other. But I think what Hobbes really means is that the state of nature is a thought experiment, a tool to help us understand politics. Just like physicists imagine a world without friction, it doesn't mean such a world really exists, but it's to understand the laws of motion. Hobbes imagined a world without government also to make us understand the necessity of government. But ironically, this state of nature Hobbes describes has indeed repeatedly appeared in history to some extent. Whenever a government collapses, whenever a war breaks out, whenever social order disintegrates, humans return to that war of all against all. Look at Somalia during civil war, look at the Syrian civil war, look at any failed state. Isn't it very much like Hobbes' state of nature? No law, no order, warlords fighting, people displaced. Human life indeed becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So although Hobbes' theory looks extreme, it really captures some truth about human nature and the essence of society. If humans don't have a strong constraint mechanism, they really will fall into chaos and violence. But the question is Hobbes' solution too extreme? He says we need to establish a Leviathan with absolute power. This Leviathan can decide everything, and people have no right to resist. Isn't this saying that to avoid war, we should accept authoritarianism? Many people criticize Hobbes for this, saying he's an apologist for despotism. But I think this understanding is a bit simplistic, because Hobbes actually gives us a deeper insight. He lets us see that there's deep tension between order and freedom. If you want absolute freedom, you must bear the cost of chaos. If you want absolute order, you must accept the risk of despotism. And human political history is essentially the history of seeking balance between these two extremes. Democratic systems try to find balance between the two, having enough power to maintain order while having enough checks to protect freedom. But this balance is very fragile. One misstep and it could slide toward either extreme. And Hobbes also reminds us not to romanticize government power. Government isn't some embodiment of morality, isn't some guardian of justice. It's essentially a power machine, a violence monopoly institution. We need it not because it's so noble, but because we need something to stop greater violence. This recognition is still important today, because many people idealize government, thinking government should represent the people's will, should realize justice and fairness. But Hobbes would say, wake up, government's most basic function is maintaining order. As for justice and fairness, those are secondary. You might think this is too cold, but think about it, a government that can't maintain order is useless no matter how much it talks about justice. Syria's government might be corrupt and authoritarian, but at least before the civil war, ordinary people could live normally. After the civil war, even life safety couldn't be guaranteed. What's there to talk about justice? This is what Hobbes wants to tell us: order is the prerequisite for everything. Without order, nothing can be discussed. But this is also the most dangerous aspect of Hobbes' theory, because it can be used to justify any form of despotism. Any dictator can say, look, without my strong rule, society would fall into chaos, so you should obey me. This logic is so powerful that it's been used countless times in history. But the question is this logic really correct? Hobbes says in the state of nature humans will kill each other, so we need a Leviathan to stop it. But what if Leviathan itself is killing the people? What if Leviathan causes more deaths than the state of nature? There really are such examples in history. Some despotic governments killed far more people than any civil war. So in this case, does Hobbes' theory still hold? This is the problem later thinkers had to solve. Locke said people have the right to resist tyranny, Rousseau said sovereignty belongs to the people and can't be ceded, Montesquieu said powers must be separated and check each other. They're all trying to revise Hobbes' theory, trying to find a better balance between order and freedom. But no matter what, they can't avoid Hobbes, because Hobbes raised the most fundamental questions. How does human society move from a state of mutual harm to a state of peace? What is the legitimate basis of political power? These questions still have no perfect answers today, and although Hobbes' answer is disturbing, its honesty and thoroughness can't be ignored. Now let's talk about Hobbes' craziest imagination. What exactly is this thing called Leviathan? You know, the cover illustration of Hobbes' book is itself a work of art. The image shows a giant human figure, and this human figure's body is composed of countless little people. He holds a sword in one hand and a scepter in the other, overlooking the city below. This image is so stunning, it conveys several layers of meaning simultaneously. First, Leviathan is composed of the people. Those little people are each individual who signed the contract. Their bodies piece together this giant, which shows sovereignty comes from the people. But at the same time, this giant is also independent above the people. He overlooks the city, holding weapons and power, which shows that once sovereignty is formed, it towers above the people. See how contradictory yet how exquisite this image is. Hobbes says Leviathan has 4 faces. Let's look at them one by one. The first face, Leviathan is God. What does this mean? It means Leviathan possesses absolute authority like God. Whatever it says goes. Its will is law, its judgment is truth. In the Middle Ages, people believed only God possessed this kind of absolute authority. The king's power came from God, so the king also had to obey God's laws. But Hobbes says no, in the secular world, Leviathan is the supreme authority. It doesn't need to answer to anyone, including God. This view was absolutely outrageous at the time, because it essentially said secular power could override religious power. Hobbes even says Leviathan can decide what is orthodox religious belief. If Leviathan says a certain doctrine is heretical, then it's heretical. Think about it, how terrifying this was for people at the time. Shouldn't religion be independent of politics? Shouldn't the church have its own authority? But Hobbes says no. If you allow the church to have independent authority, then there are 2 sovereigns, which will lead to division and conflict. He says, didn't the English Civil War start exactly like this? Wasn't it because the boundaries between religious and political power were unclear? So Leviathan must control everything, including religion. Only this way can unity and order be guaranteed. This logic sounds very authoritarian, right? But think carefully, aren't modern states like this too? What is the principle of separation of church and state? Isn't it saying religion must submit to secular law? You can have religious beliefs, but if your religious practices violate the law, law takes priority. Isn't this what Hobbes means by Leviathan possessing supreme authority? It's just that modern states package this authority more gently, but essentially it's the same. Leviathan's second face is beast. This is more straightforward. Leviathan itself is a sea monster from the Bible, the kind of monster so fierce it's unimaginable. Hobbes didn't choose this image without reason. He deliberately wants to tell you that the sovereign must possess overwhelming force, must make everyone feel fear. You might ask, why fear? Shouldn't government make people love it? Hobbes would say love is unreliable, fear is reliable. Because love is an emotion, and emotions change. You love today, you might hate tomorrow. But fear is different. Fear is based on rational calculation. I know if I break the law I'll be punished, so I don't dare break the law. This is why Leviathan must be a monster, must possess frightening power. And Hobbes says this power must be monopolized. Only Leviathan can use violence, no one else can. This is the modern state's principle of violence monopoly. Police and military can use force, but ordinary people can't. Isn't this Hobbes's invention? But the beast image also has another layer of meaning. Leviathan is non-rational, is wild, is beyond human control. Hobbes actually saw this point. He knew once you create Leviathan, it might get out of control. Like Frankenstein's monster, which ultimately threatens its creator. But Hobbes says there's no choice, we must take this risk, because the risk of not having Leviathan is greater than having it. This choice is too cruel, but Hobbes is just this honest. He won't tell you there's a perfect solution. Leviathan's third face is human. Hobbes says Leviathan is an artificial person, a giant artificial body. What does this mean? It means Leviathan is like a human, it has a soul, has thoughts, has will, can make decisions, can take action. And Leviathan's various parts are like human body organs, each performing its function. Hobbes really likes using this kind of analogy. He says the king is the heart, officials are joints, military is arms, money is blood. This analogy was popular at the time. William Harvey, who we mentioned earlier, also used similar metaphors. But Hobbes developed it more systematically. He really imagined the state as an organism. This imagination is important because it implies one thing: Leviathan is alive. It's not a dead institution, not a pile of cold rules, but a living existence. It will grow, will change, will adapt to the environment, and will even die. And just like the human body, Leviathan's various parts must work in coordination. If the heart stops beating, the whole body dies. If an organ has problems, the whole body is affected. This is why Hobbes emphasizes sovereignty can't be divided, because a person can't have two hearts, right? If you divide power among different institutions, It's like installing two hearts in the body, that will only lead to conflict and chaos. This view is completely opposite to later separation of powers theory. Montesquieu says powers must be separated, legislative, executive, judicial must check each other. But Hobbes says no, separation of powers is division, division will lead to civil war. See, this is the eternal debate in political theory, centralization or separation of powers, efficiency or checks and balances. Hobbes firmly stands on the side of centralization because he's too afraid of division and chaos. Leviathan's fourth face is machine. This is the most modern aspect. Hobbes says Leviathan is an artificial machine, designed and built. This view was absolutely revolutionary in the 17th century, because it means political order isn't natural, isn't arranged by God, but is created by humans. Just like a watchmaker makes a watch, humans can design and manufacture the machine called the state. And machine means it can be disassembled and reassembled, can be improved and optimized. This is why Hobbes's theory is the starting point of modern political science, because he liberated politics from theology and ethics, turned it into a technology. To establish a state, you don't ask what God's will is, don't flip through old books looking for precedents, but design it like an engineer. Whatever goal you want to achieve, you design whatever kind of machine. If your goal is peace and order, then you need a powerful Leviathan. If your goal is freedom and prosperity, then you might need a different design. This thinking was so ahead of its time that Hobbes's contemporaries couldn't understand it at all. They'd say, how can the state be a machine? The state is sacred, has a moral mission. But Hobbes says stop with that nonsense, the state is just a tool for solving problems. This view is already very common today. When we discuss government, we say whether this system is effective or ineffective, whether this policy can achieve its purpose. We evaluate government as a tool, not worship it as a moral authority. Isn't this the tradition Hobbes started? But the machine metaphor also has its dangers, because machines are cold, have no feelings. If you treat the state as a machine, don't people become parts of the machine? And machines can be manipulated. Who manipulates this machine? Hobbes says the sovereign, but will the sovereign abuse this machine for personal gain? This is the biggest loophole in Leviathan theory. Hobbes assumes the sovereign will use power for the public good. But history tells us power almost always corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what was Hobbes really thinking? Did he really believe the sovereign wouldn't abuse power? Actually, Hobbes knew this problem, but his answer is very cold. He says even if the sovereign abuses power, it's better than not having a sovereign. Because no matter how bad the sovereign is, it's just the evil of one person or a small group. But if there's no sovereign, the whole society will fall into evil and chaos, that's the evil of all against all. Do the math, how many people can a tyrant kill? But how many can a civil war kill? Hobbes would say a tyrant is still more cost-effective. This logic is too cold-blooded, but also too realistic. Look at those civil wars in history, French Revolution, Russian Civil War, Chinese Civil War, Spanish Civil War, how many people died? Then look at those authoritarian regimes, they're certainly terrible, but did they really kill more people than civil wars? This is the cruel truth Hobbes wants us to face. In the political realm, many times we can only choose the less bad option between two bad options. But there's a deeper question here. Hobbes says we created Leviathan through social contract. So how exactly is this social contract signed? Hobbes's description is very interesting. He says each person signs with each other, ceding power to a third party. Note, it's not the people signing with the sovereign, but people signing among themselves. This design is very clever because it means the sovereign isn't a party to the contract, so the sovereign isn't bound by the contract. You might say this isn't fair, why are only we bound while the sovereign isn't? Hobbes says because if the sovereign is also bound, then who enforces this constraint? If there's an even higher authority that can constrain the sovereign, then that authority is the real sovereign. So sovereignty must be absolute, can't be constrained by anything, otherwise it's not sovereignty. This logic is too rigorous to the point of despair. And Hobbes also says once you sign the contract, you can't back out. You can't say I don't want this sovereign anymore, I want my power back. Because if everyone can exit any time, the contract is meaningless and will return to the state of nature. So Hobbes's social contract is a one-way irreversible process. Once you enter, you can't get out. It's like signing a slave contract, and it's permanent. You might think, who would agree to such a contract? Isn't this selling yourself into slavery? But Hobbes says, when you're facing war of all against all, when you live in fear every day, you will agree. Like a drowning person, they'll grab anything that can save their life, even if it's a thorny branch. Leviathan is that thorny branch, but at least it can keep you alive. This metaphor is too cruel, but also too real. Look at those countries that experienced civil war, look at those people living in chaos. What will they choose? Many times they'll choose strongman politics, choose iron-fisted rule, because they're too desperate for order. This is what Hobbes predicted. When society falls into chaos, people will actively give up freedom in exchange for security. And history has proven this prophecy again and again. The chaos of the Weimar Republic led to the Nazis coming to power, Russia's turmoil led to Stalin's centralization. Every time it was the people themselves who chose Leviathan. Of course, you could say they were deceived, manipulated, but to some extent, it was also a choice. A choice made in desperation. And what Hobbes wants to tell us is that this choice is rational. In that situation, choosing a powerful authority to end chaos is rational. This is the most terrifying aspect of Hobbes's theory. It's not justifying despotism, but explaining why despotism emerges. It tells us despotism isn't imposed on people by some bad person, but is people's rational choice under specific conditions. This insight is so profound that it makes all democratic theorists uneasy. Because it implies democracy is fragile. If society falls into chaos, people might actively abandon democracy. And Hobbes also points out a more subtle problem. The source of sovereignty and the exercise of sovereignty are two different things. Leviathan's power comes from the people. This is the foundation of contract theory. But when Leviathan exercises power, it doesn't need people's consent. This creates a paradox. People are the source of sovereignty but not the possessor of sovereignty. It's like you created a robot, but once the robot starts, you can't control it. This paradox is everywhere in modern politics. We say popular sovereignty, say government's power comes from the people. But does government consult everyone when making decisions? No. During elections you cast one vote, but what can you do for the next 4 years? You can only wait for the next election. Isn't this what Hobbes said? Once you cede power, you can't control it anymore. Of course, modern democratic systems have many mechanisms to limit government power, separation of powers, press freedom, judicial independence. But essentially all these mechanisms are limiting Leviathan's power, preventing it from becoming that absolute power monster Hobbes imagined. From this perspective, all of modern political history is a history of taming Leviathan. We accepted Hobbes's diagnosis: humans need a powerful state to maintain order. But we don't accept his prescription. We don't want a Leviathan with absolute power. So we invented various systems to limit it, to tame it, to make it serve us rather than rule us. But the problem is this taming process will never be complete. Because Leviathan's nature is to expand power, to break free from constraints. Every crisis, every state of emergency, Leviathan demands more power. And people often agree, because Hobbes was right. In the face of fear, people choose security over freedom. Look at America after September 11th, look at governments around the world during the pandemic. Did government power expand or shrink? Every crisis is an opportunity for Leviathan to grow. Every emergency state leaves some permanent power expansion. This is Hobbes's legacy to us, an eternal dilemma. We need Leviathan to protect us, but we also need to protect ourselves from being harmed by Leviathan. This balance is so difficult that human civilization hasn't found a perfect answer in thousands of years. Now we face the biggest puzzle Hobbes left us. This puzzle is Hobbes the enemy of freedom or the friend of freedom? This sounds very contradictory, right? How could someone advocating absolute power be a friend of freedom? But the fact is so bizarre. Hobbes simultaneously became the theoretical source of both modern authoritarianism and modern liberalism. I know this sounds incredible, but let me explain slowly. First, Hobbes was indeed the first person to systematically argue for absolute sovereignty. All later authoritarian theories can be traced back to him. Hitler said state interests above all. Stalin said party interests above all. All totalitarians say for collective interests, individuals must submit. Isn't this Hobbes's logic? To avoid war of all against all, we must submit to Leviathan. And those most terrifying regimes of the 20th century all had one common feature: they monopolized violence and controlled everything. Isn't this exactly the Leviathan Hobbes designed? So many people treat Hobbes as the theoretical godfather of totalitarianism, saying he paved the way for despotism. But ironically, Hobbes is also one of the founders of modern liberalism. How so? Because Hobbes did several revolutionary things. First, he separated politics from religion. Before Hobbes, political authority had to have religious legitimacy, the king's power came from God. But Hobbes says no, political power comes from people's contract, from rational calculation, it has nothing to do with God. This laid the theoretical foundation for separation of church and state, and separation of church and state is one of the most important principles of modern free societies. Second, Hobbes acknowledged human natural rights. Although he only acknowledged one right, the right to life, this is already remarkable. Because he says this right is natural, not granted by the king, not bestowed by God, but something you naturally have as a human. This is the starting point of natural rights theory. Later Locke added property rights and liberty, Jefferson added the pursuit of happiness. But this theoretical framework was established by Hobbes. Third, and most important, Hobbes believed humans are equal. He says nature makes humans roughly equal in body and mind. This is a revolutionary view. Because before Hobbes, European society was hierarchical, nobles were naturally noble, commoners naturally base, and this was unchangeable. But Hobbes says no, humans are essentially equal. Differences are only caused by environment. This laid the foundation for modern concepts of equality. See, Hobbes on one hand argues for absolute power, on the other hand argues for individual rights and human equality. How can these two things be compatible? The answer is they really aren't compatible. This is the tension within Hobbes's theory. And this tension is precisely the core tension of modern politics. On one hand we need a powerful state to maintain order, on the other hand we need to protect individual rights from state violation. How to resolve this contradiction? Hobbes didn't give an answer, or the answer he gave we don't accept. His answer is, state power takes priority, individual rights submit. But later liberals said no, individual rights take priority, state power must be limited. From Locke to Rawls, the entire liberal tradition is trying to solve this problem Hobbes left behind. But you know what's most ironic? No matter which side you stand on, you can't avoid Hobbes. To argue for state power, you start from Hobbes's social contract theory. To argue for individual rights, you also start from Hobbes's natural rights theory. He's like a giant crossroads, all modern political theory must pass through this crossroads. And what's even more terrifying is that the dilemma Hobbes described is more real today than ever. Look at the problems we face now. When pandemic comes, should government enforce quarantine? Should it track your whereabouts? Terrorist threats, should government monitor communications? Should it restrict free speech? Climate crisis, should government enforce emission reductions? Should it restrict individual lifestyles? Every question is asking the same Hobbesian question: for collective security, how much individual freedom should we give up? And you'll find that in crisis moments, people always tend to choose security over freedom. When the pandemic just started, how many people in China supported strict lockdowns, health codes, various surveillance measures? After September 11th, how many Americans supported the Patriot Act, supported NSA's surveillance programs? Every time it's the same: when crisis comes, Leviathan becomes stronger. If Hobbes were alive today, he'd definitely say, "See, what did I tell you? Humans choose obedience in the face of fear." But the question is, after these crises pass, do those powers disappear? History tells us no. Powers granted to government during emergency states often become permanent. Once surveillance systems are established, they're very hard to dismantle. This is what Hobbes didn't foresee, or foresaw but didn't care about. Leviathan will grow, will evolve, will become stronger and stronger. And our dependence on it will also grow deeper. Now imagine if the government suddenly disappeared, what would happen? Not that the government collapsed, but that the entire government apparatus suddenly ceased to exist. No police, no courts, no military, no public services. Would you dare go outside? Would your property still be safe? Could you still live normally? Most people would say that would be a disaster. This proves Hobbes was right, we really need Leviathan. We can't live without it. But at the same time, we also see Leviathan's dangers. Government will abuse power, will violate human rights, will become an oppression machine. So our current situation is, can't live without Leviathan, but also can't completely trust it. This is the curse Hobbes gave us, an eternal dilemma. And this dilemma has become even more serious in the digital age. Because modern technology makes Leviathan unprecedentedly powerful. Surveillance cameras everywhere in cities, facial recognition technology omnipresent, big data can track your every move. The information and power government holds far exceeds any monarch in Hobbes's era. 17th century kings who wanted to control people had to send armies, build prisons, use violence. But modern governments can use algorithms, use data, use invisible hands to control you. Your credit score, your electronic consumption records, your digital footprint, all these become tools to control you. And what's most terrifying is that much of the time you're voluntary. For convenience, you hand personal information to platforms. For security, you accept government surveillance. For efficiency, you let algorithms make decisions for you. Isn't this what Hobbes called social contract? You actively give up freedom in exchange for benefits. Except now this contract isn't signed once, but is being signed every moment of every day. Every time you click agree, every time you authorize access, you're signing a small social contract. And all these contracts together constitute a huge digital Leviathan. This digital Leviathan is more powerful than anything Hobbes imagined. Because it doesn't just control your behavior, it can influence your thoughts. Algorithms can decide what information you see, social media can shape your views, AI can predict your behavior. This isn't just what Hobbes called maintaining order, this is shaping reality itself. And most ironically, this digital Leviathan often isn't government but private companies. Google, Facebook, Amazon, these tech giants have power that in some ways exceeds government. They can decide what news you see, can ban your account, can control your digital life. Hobbes completely didn't foresee this. He thought Leviathan must be government. But now we find power can exist in various forms. And these tech companies also say, we're not Leviathan, we're private enterprises, you can choose not to use our services. But the question is, can you really choose? Can you not use smartphones? Can you not use the internet? Can you completely leave the digital world? For most people, these are no longer choices but necessities of survival. So what we face now is a multi-headed Leviathan. Government is one, tech companies are another, there might be others. And these Leviathans also collude with each other. Government uses tech companies' data to monitor people, tech companies use government power to maintain monopolies. Hobbes's nightmare came true, except it's more complex, more hidden, and harder to resist than he imagined. So what should we do? Some say we should limit government power, should have separation of powers and checks and balances, should protect individual freedom. This is liberalism's answer, also the mainstream answer. But Hobbes would say you're just making society fragile, just giving chaos an opportunity. Others say we should strengthen collectivism, should make government more powerful, should sacrifice individual interests for collective interests. This is authoritarianism's answer, also a dangerous answer. But Hobbes would say at least this is honest, at least this acknowledges the importance of order. I think the real answer might be, we must accept this dilemma rather than try to solve it. Because this dilemma is unsolvable. The tension between individual freedom and collective order is eternal. You can't have both. You can only make different trade-offs at different moments, in different situations. Sometimes you need more freedom, sometimes you need more order. The key is to stay vigilant, to be aware of the cost of each choice. When you support government taking tough measures, think about the consequences. When you advocate individual freedom, also think about whether this will lead to chaos. This is what Hobbes taught us. Politics isn't choosing between good and bad, but weighing between two imperfect options. And this weighing will never end. Every generation must do it anew. Our generation faces the Hobbesian dilemma of the digital age. Our children might face the Hobbesian dilemma of the AI age. But no matter how the form changes, the essence is the same, how to find balance between order and freedom. Hobbes saw this problem 370 years ago, and he presented it in the most cold and honest way. He won't comfort you, won't tell you there's a perfect solution. He'll just force you to face this dilemma directly, force you to make choices. And this is perhaps why Hobbes is still important today. Not because his answer is right, but because his question is right. The questions he asked, about human nature, about power, about order and freedom. These questions will never become outdated. As long as humans still live in society, as long as we still need government to maintain order, we can't escape Hobbes's ghost. Back to the hypothesis we started with, now you understand, right? This isn't science fiction, this is the latest version of the Hobbesian question. Would you accept an AI Leviathan if it could guarantee optimal decisions and maintain the best order? Many would say no. I want to keep my freedom, I want to make my own decisions. But if society falls into chaos, if humans themselves can't solve climate crisis, resource scarcity, nuclear war threats, would you still say no then? Hobbes would say by then you'll beg AI to rule you, just like the English begged the king to return after the Civil War. This prophecy is too terrifying, but might also be too accurate. Because history has proven again and again that when humans face existential threats, they choose order over freedom. And Hobbes's genius lies in seeing through 21st century human nature in the 17th century. So next time when you see debates about government power, debates about surveillance and privacy, trade-offs between freedom and security, remember Hobbes, remember that old man in thick coat who looked like a bear. Remember his book about the sea monster. Because what he tells us isn't an answer, but an eternal warning. Leviathan is always there. The question is, can we tame it, or will we ultimately be devoured by it? And the answer to this question needs to be written by each generation through action. That's it for today's story. If you enjoyed this thought adventure, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the journey of thought has just begun. Hobbes is just the beginning. There are still Locke, Rousseau, Kant ahead, and countless fascinating thoughts waiting for us to explore. But no matter how far we go, we'll find Hobbes's shadow is always there. Because he asked that most fundamental question, how should humans live together? This question had no answer in the 17th century and still has no answer in the 21st century. But perhaps asking this question itself is already part of the answer. Friends, let me spend the last few minutes wrapping up this story. You know, when preparing this episode, I kept thinking about one question. Why does a 370-year-old man, a weirdo called an atheist by his contemporaries, a marginal figure the Royal Society wouldn't even let join, why does he have such great influence on our world today? The answer might be simple, and might be terrifying. Because we never left Hobbes's world. We think we've entered the age of democracy, the age of freedom, the age of human rights. But actually we just repackaged Hobbes's Leviathan. Modern states still monopolize violence, still possess overwhelming power, still operate like a huge machine. It's just that this machine now has a constitutional shell, democratic procedures, human rights decorations. But its essence hasn't changed. It's still that Leviathan, that monster we created but can't completely control. And each of us still lives in that Hobbesian dilemma. Every morning you wake up, open your phone, see various news, various debates, various conflicts. You'll find humans are still arguing over the same problems. What is justice? What is freedom? What is fairness? Everyone thinks they're right, everyone thinks others are stupid. Isn't this what Hobbes called the war of ideas? Then you see government issuing various policies, some you support, some you oppose. But whether you support or oppose, you must obey. Because government possesses that ultimate power, that coercive force. Isn't this what Hobbes called Leviathan? And when crisis comes, when pandemic breaks out, when terrorist attacks occur, you'll find yourself willing to give up some freedom in exchange for security. You'll support stricter controls, more surveillance, stronger government. Isn't this what Hobbes called social contract? So Hobbes's genius isn't that he predicted the future, but that he saw through the eternal. He saw through those things in human nature that will never change. Fear of death, desire for honor, need for security. He saw through the nature of power, saw through the price of order. And most importantly, he saw through that dilemma we can never escape. We need Leviathan to protect us from harming each other. But at the same time we need to protect ourselves from being harmed by Leviathan. This dilemma existed in Hobbes's era, exists in our era, and will still exist in the foreseeable future. Maybe one day AI will develop to the point of replacing government, making optimal decisions. Maybe one day we'll enter some post-human era, no longer needing this form of political organization. But until that day comes, we still live in Hobbes's world. Still facing the questions he raised, still making those difficult choices he described. And I think this is perhaps the greatest value of studying intellectual history. Not to find answers, because many questions simply have no answers. But to see more clearly where we are, to face our dilemmas more honestly. Hobbes didn't give us a beautiful vision, didn't promise an ideal society. He just told us in the most cold way what politics is. Politics isn't about ideals, isn't about justice, isn't about virtue. Politics is about how to make a group of humans who mutually suspect each other, compete with each other, might harm each other at any time. Live together reluctantly, fragilely, temporarily. And this reluctant, fragile, temporary peace is already the best state we can achieve. This recognition might be depressing, but might also be sobering. Because when you understand this, you won't have unrealistic fantasies about politics. You won't believe in perfect systems, won't expect sage leaders. You'll understand politics is always an art of compromise, choosing the least bad among various imperfect options. And this sober recognition is perhaps more valuable than any utopian fantasy. Because it's precisely those utopian fantasies, those pursuits of perfect society, that often led to the most terrible disasters in human history. Those who believed they could create a perfect world would often stop at nothing to achieve this goal, including destroying everything that exists. And Hobbes would say, wake up, there's no perfect world. What we can do is just try to avoid the worst situation. Try not to let Leviathan become too terrible, try to find a tolerable balance between order and freedom. This isn't sexy, isn't exciting, but this is real. So next time when you see someone talking about grand political ideals, about thorough social transformation, about perfect institutional design, remember that old man Hobbes. Remember he'd ask in the most sarcastic tone. Then what? How do you plan to stop humans from harming each other? If you don't have a practical answer, then it's all empty talk. And if your answer is to build a more powerful power machine, then you're just repeating what Hobbes said 370 years ago. Except you might not be as honest as Hobbes, not as brave as him in admitting the costs this power machine will bring. This is what I want to tell you through today's story. Hobbes isn't a hero you should worship, nor a villain you should despise. He's just an observer who's terrifyingly honest. Someone who displayed the truth about human nature and politics in the most naked way. And this honesty, in today's world full of hypocrisy and self-deception, is perhaps more precious than ever. Alright, that's it for today's thought experiment. If this story made you think, made you feel something, please give a like, leave a comment, tell me your thoughts. See you next time. Goodbye.